Look at your nose in the mirror right now. You probably never think about it. It is just there, sitting in the middle of your face, the same nose you had as a kid, the same nose that shows up in every family photo next to your parents and your cousins and your grandparents. Most people never ask why their nose looks the way it does. But a few years ago, scientists finally cracked open the genetic code behind nose shape, and what they found was much bigger than anyone expected. It was not just about faces. It was about migration, survival, ice ages, lost lands, and even a different species of human that no longer exists. If you have a wide or broad nose, or if your family comes from Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Philippines, the Pacific Islands, or anywhere near that part of the world, this story is about you. Your nose shape is not random. It carries a record of where your ancestors lived, what they survived, and who they mixed with tens of thousands of years ago. Stick around, because some of what researchers uncovered came from places nobody was even looking. Let's start with the actual research, because a lot of what got shared online only covered a small piece of it and missed the real story. The major study on nose shape genetics came out a few years back in a well-known scientific journal. Researchers gathered genetic information from thousands of people across Latin America, the United Kingdom, and several other regions. What made this study stand out was not just how many people were involved, but how carefully they broke the problem down. Earlier studies had treated nose shape as one single trait. This team split it into separate parts: how wide the nose is, how tall it is, the size of the nostrils, the shape of the tip, and the angle where the nose meets the upper lip. Then they searched the genome for the exact spots that control each of these features on their own. One gene kept showing up again and again. DCHS2. Scientists already suspected it played some role in nose shape, but this research finally showed exactly what it does. DCHS2 affects how cartilage grows in the tip of the nose and how far the nose sticks out from the face. People with one version of this gene tend to have a narrower, more pointed nose tip. People with a different version tend to have a flatter, broader tip. When researchers mapped these gene versions across populations around the world, a clear picture appeared. The version linked to flatter, broader noses showed up most often in people with roots in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. The version linked to narrower, more projected noses was more common in Europe and parts of Northeast Asia. That part alone was not shocking. Climate and nose shape have been linked in science for a long time. What really surprised researchers was a second gene called RUNX2. RUNX2 was not a new discovery. Scientists have studied it for years because of its role in bone growth, especially how bones form before birth. Nobody had seriously connected it to nose shape until this study. It turned out that different versions of RUNX2 strongly affect the width of the nose, especially the bridge and the space between the nostrils. When researchers checked which populations carried which version, the pattern was striking. The version linked to wider nasal bridges and broader nostrils showed up at very high rates in populations from hot, humid regions near the equator, places like sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and the islands of the Pacific. But it also appeared at surprisingly high rates in groups that had nothing to do with hot climates, indigenous communities high in the Andes Mountains, and certain populations in East Asia living far from the equator. That raised a real question. Why would people living in cold mountain regions or temperate zones carry the same wide nose gene as people living in the tropics? To answer that, scientists had to dig into the deep evolutionary history behind these genes, and that is where things get really interesting. The standard explanation for different nose shapes around the world is called climate adaptation, and it is a solid, well-tested idea. In hot, wet climates, a wide nose with big nostrils works well because it lets air move through quickly without needing much warming or moisturizing, which makes sense in a place where the air is already warm and humid. In cold, dry places, a narrower, longer nose works better because it slows air down and warms it up before it reaches the lungs, protecting the airway from damage. This idea has been backed by data since studies from the 1970s, and it is even used today by forensic scientists trying to estimate a person's ancestry from skeletal remains. But climate adaptation alone cannot explain everything. It cannot explain why people in the Andes have the same gene as people near the equator. It cannot explain why certain East Asian populations far from any tropical region carry it too. And when scientists calculated how fast these gene versions spread through certain populations, the numbers did not match slow, gradual climate adjustment over tens of thousands of years. Something else was going on, something that pushed these traits into specific groups of people much faster than expected. This is where ancient DNA research completely changed the story. In the last decade or so, the ability to pull genetic material out of very old human remains has advanced enormously. Scientists can now read DNA from bones that are tens of thousands of years old, and what they have learned about Southeast Asia in particular has flipped old assumptions upside down. For most of the last century, the accepted story of Southeast Asia went something like this. An ancient group of people, sometimes linked to the ancestors of today's Aboriginal Australians and Papuan New Guineans, settled the region first. Then, around 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, a large wave of farmers moved south from what is now China and Taiwan. These farmers brought agriculture, new languages, and new tools, and over time they either replaced the earlier people or mixed with them until the old genetic traces mostly faded away. This idea is often called the out of Taiwan model, and it does explain a lot, including how related languages spread from Madagascar all the way to islands in the far Pacific. Then ancient DNA samples started coming back from very old burial sites in places like Vietnam, Laos, and Malaysia, some over 8,000 years old, and the results did not match the old model at all. These ancient people were not simply the ancestors of today's Papuans, and they were not simply the ancestors of today's Han Chinese or Taiwanese groups either. They were something different, a separate population with their own distinct genetic fingerprint, one that included the broad-nosed gene variants at very high rates. Scientists began calling this group the people of Sundaland. Sundaland was a huge stretch of land that connected mainland Southeast Asia to islands like Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, back when sea levels were much lower during the last ice age. At its peak, roughly 20,000 years ago, Sundaland was an actual continent bigger than Western Europe, full of rivers, forests, and grassland, more than enough to support a large, thriving population. And that population did thrive. Ancient DNA suggests people lived on Sundaland as a distinct group for at least 50,000 years, maybe longer. They were not just passing through, they were settled, established, and genetically unique, and part of that genetic identity was a very high rate of the wide-nosed gene variants. When farming groups later arrived from the north, they did not wipe out the Sundaland population. They mixed with them, and the amount of mixing varied a lot depending on location. On the mainland, in places like Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos, the mixing was heavy, and modern populations there carry a fairly even blend of both ancestries. In the islands, the picture is even more layered. The Philippines especially shows evidence of at least 3 or 4 separate waves of ancestry stacked on top of each other over thousands of years. But no matter how many waves arrived, the broad-nosed gene variants stayed present through all of them, because they were already baked into the original Sundaland population before any of the later migrations even happened. That explains a lot about the Philippines, Indonesia, and Malaysia, but it still does not fully explain the East Asian groups or the connection to indigenous people in South America. For that, we need to go back even further, to a population older than anything we have direct ancient DNA samples from yet. Researchers refer to this older group using terms like ancient East Asian or basal East Asian ancestry. This was the population that eventually gave rise to both the people of Sundaland and, further north, the ancestors of Northeast Asian populations, including the groups who eventually crossed into the Americas. This detail matters a lot. The people who walked across the ancient land bridge from Asia into the Americas somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago descended from this same deep ancestral population, and they carried the broad-nosed gene variants with them. That is exactly why indigenous populations across the Americas, from the high mountains of the Andes to the open plains of North America to the rainforests of the Amazon, show higher rates of these gene variants than the local climate alone would predict. They did not develop these traits because of the environment they later settled in. They inherited them from ancestors who carried them out of Asia tens of thousands of years earlier. This creates a real problem for modern DNA testing companies. Many of the reference databases these companies use to estimate a person's ancestry are built mostly from present-day populations, without fully accounting for 50,000 years of Sundaland history or 20,000 years of genetic change across the Americas. Because of this gap, broad-nosed gene variants in people with Filipino, Indonesian, Pacific Islander, or Indigenous American ancestry sometimes get mislabeled or underrepresented in commercial ancestry reports. Not because the genetics are not real, but because the databases behind the tests are not deep enough yet to interpret them correctly. This is a known limitation in the industry, and some researchers have been pushing for better reference data for years. Now here is where the story gets even stranger: archaic introgression. Archaic introgression is the scientific term for what happens when modern humans interbreed with other, now extinct human species, groups like Neanderthals, Denisovans, and possibly others we have not fully identified yet. This is not a theory. It is confirmed repeatedly through genetic evidence. Roughly 1 to 4% of the genome of every person outside Africa today comes from Neanderthals, a leftover from interbreeding that happened when modern humans first spread out of Africa around 60 to 70,000 years ago. But when it comes to nose shape and Asian ancestry, the more surprising story involves a different group entirely: the Denisovans. Denisovans were first identified from a tiny fingerbone fragment discovered in a Siberian cave back in 2010. We do not have a full skeleton or even a skull. What we do have is a surprisingly complete genome pulled from that small bone fragment and a few other scraps of material. When scientists compared this genome to modern human populations, they found something remarkable. Denisovan DNA shows up in people today, but it is not spread evenly at all. It is heavily concentrated in one group in particular, Melanesians, people from places like Papua New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. These populations carry somewhere between 3 and 5% Denisovan-derived DNA, which is actually a higher share than the Neanderthal DNA found in most people outside Africa. In the early 2020s, a research team published findings identifying a specific region of Denisovan-derived DNA that appears to shape nose and facial structure in Melanesian populations. This region is linked to a broader facial profile, wider nostrils, and a flatter nasal bridge. Think about what that actually means. Some part of the broad nose trait in Melanesian populations may not come from modern human evolution at all. It may come from a completely different human species, one we only learned existed a little over a decade ago. Modern humans interbred with them, carried some of their DNA forward, and in the process may have picked up physical traits that evolved separately in that other lineage over hundreds of thousands of years in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, long before modern humans ever arrived there. This is genuine, peer-reviewed science, confirmed by multiple independent research teams, even though it has not made its way into mainstream conversation much yet because the research is still fairly new and fairly technical. It means that when you look at a broad nose, especially in someone with Melanesian roots, you might be looking at a trait with a history stretching back not just 50,000 years, but possibly hundreds of thousands of years, to a branch of the human family tree that no longer exists, except for the fragments still living on in our DNA today. People sometimes ask whether mate preference, choosing partners, partly based on looks, played a role in shaping nose traits over time. That force is real in evolution generally, but whether it mattered much for nose shape specifically is still debated. Some scientists think it had little effect. Others argue that in small, isolated groups, mate preferences could shift visible traits fairly quickly and may have added to differences that started with climate adaptation. Honestly, nobody knows for certain. What we do know is that by the time ancient DNA lets us look back in time, these gene variants are already common. However that combination of climate, ancient interbreeding, and other pressures came together, it happened long before any written history existed. Let's bring this back to something personal. In a very literal, DNA-confirmed sense, if you carry these traits, you are carrying genetic material from a population that survived on a continent that does not exist anymore, that interbred with at least one now extinct human species, and whose descendants eventually spread across a huge stretch of the planet. Standard ancestry tests do not always explain this well. A result that simply says Southeast Asian or Filipino or Pacific Islander is really just an approximation. The reference data behind these tests keeps improving every year, but it still does not fully capture the depth of what those labels actually represent. The Sunderland ancestry, the Denisovan piece, the ancient East Asian lineage that existed long before farming spread through the region. Researchers at major universities and large-scale genome projects have been working to build deeper reference panels that include ancient DNA and populations that were historically left out of earlier databases, precisely because current commercial tests are missing so much. What they keep finding is that the genetic history of Southeast Asian and Pacific populations is far more layered and complex than the simple categories on a typical consumer DNA report suggest. If you have ever looked at your ancestry results and felt like something was missing, you were probably right. Not because the test was wrong, but because the science of tracing ancient human migration through modern DNA is still developing. There is more depth there than current tools can fully show. There is one more part of this story that does not get talked about enough, especially for people who grew up in Western countries with Southeast Asian or Pacific Islander backgrounds. For much of the last century, broader facial features tied to Asian and Pacific populations were often looked down on by Western beauty standards. Broad noses in particular were sometimes treated as markers of being different, sometimes by outsiders, and sometimes by people within these communities who absorb those same standards. Rates of nose reshaping surgery in East and Southeast Asia are among the highest in the world, especially in places like South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. And the most requested changes usually involve narrowing the bridge or reducing the width of the nostrils, the exact features this research traces back to deep ancestral history. None of this research tells anyone what to do with their own face. Choices about personal appearance are personal, full stop. But understanding where these traits actually come from, understanding that they are the physical result of 50,000 years of survival, of enduring an ice age, of a lost continent and the people who lived on it, can change how that information feels. It becomes a lot harder to see a trait as a flaw once you understand everything it took for that trait to still be here today. The research that finally mapped nose shape genetics did more than answer a question about faces. It opened up a much bigger story about how Southeast Asia and the Pacific were first settled, how people moved across that region over tens of thousands of years, who they encountered along the way, and how their descendants, connected by an unbroken genetic thread reaching back to a world that looked nothing like today's, are still walking around right now. Some of them might be watching this video. And the research is not finished. New ancient genomes get sequenced every year. New details about these old populations keep coming to light. The picture of Sunderland keeps getting sharper. The Denisovan story is almost certainly not complete either. Some scientists suspect there may be other archaic human groups that contributed DNA to Southeast Asian and Pacific populations that have not been fully identified yet. As reference databases grow and analysis tools improve, Ancestry reports for people with Southeast Asian and Pacific Islander roots are going to look noticeably different in the coming years, showing more layers, more nuance, and a much fuller picture of where those traits actually came from. That broad nose passed down from a grandmother or a great-grandmother or an ancestor whose name got lost generations ago already carries that fuller story. It always has. Science is just now catching up enough to read it properly.